fun.
Fun.
I do not understand.
You've got to get into the spirit of things. Learn to be spontaneous. Live in the moment. Do something unexpected. Get it?
Got it.
Sometimes it seems that we all kind of love to hate celebrities, even just a little bit. From enjoying watching a celebrity's public gaffe to enjoying seeing people wipe out in YouTube videos. So long as someone is getting attention, a lot of us get a kick out of seeing those people get kicked themselves. That's the basic concept of Schadenfreude. We like to see powerful people be brought down to our level and served a slice of humble pie. While we may have legitimate reasons for disliking a celebrity or even a fandom, reflected in the very valid criticisms of the Star Wars sequels or the Twilight franchise, it seems that hatred towards something or someone popular sometimes arises out of a desire to see that person or thing fail. If online cancel culture seems bad to you right now, let's just compare it for a moment to real-life political cancel culture, which is far from new. For example, George W. Bush was the laughingstock of comedians and late-night television for years, constantly mocked and ridiculed for every embarrassing flubbing of words or awkward photo op. And while most people could chuckle at Bushisms, political Schadenfreude has seemingly become more intense over time, now reaching a boiling point wherein we're no longer laughing at Bush saying something dumb or Obama stuttering, but now celebrating serious injury and danger when it befalls our political opponents or even their supporters by proxy. If we like seeing celebrities humbled because they are the rich and the famous, is that the only reason why we also like to see politicians and even their supporters humbled? Or are there other psychological aspects at play here? Today, let's take a look at the psychology of Schadenfreude in relationship to politics, as well as who is likely to experience that Schadenfreude towards politicians and when they are likely to experience it. But first, you may be seeking to amuse yourself with something a bit less depressing as real life in politics, and you can do just that by getting access to a world of media otherwise unavailable in your region due to restrictions by checking out Surfshark VPN. Surfshark allows you to quickly change your location to have access to countless TV shows and movies not available where you live. For example, Stargate SG-1, one of my favorite TV shows of all time, is only available on US Netflix, so if you don't live in the US, change your location and step through the old orifice.
What? We call it that sometimes, don't we?
The service also helps protect your browsing history from companies and entities that might be interested in your data. Surfshark's Clean Web feature also helps block ads, malware, and trackers to both help keep you safe and make your browsing experience better. You can also use Surfshark to help get great deals on products that might be more expensive based on your region. Click the link in my description and get 83% off a 3-year plan with Surfshark VPN. That's just a little over $2 a month for access to your own Stargate of media content. So, now that you have plenty of fun classic film and television shows to watch, let's switch gears to something both less pleasant and equally as interesting to gawk at. And that's why we all sometimes find the misfortunes of our political opponents to be amusing. That is, political Schadenfreude. Who is arguably more famous than the President of the United States, besides, of course, Jeb Bush?
Please clap.
I would argue that the rise in popularity of the Cope meme, for example, used to celebrate the loss of Donald Trump in 2020, or his subsequent banning from all of social media, no collusion there whatsoever, is similar to the Screaming Liberal meme of 2016, both equally illustrating a feeling of political Schadenfreude, enjoying the misfortunes of our political opponents. So is it true that Schadenfreude relates to political gains and losses? And is one side of the political aisle more prone to this feeling than the other? Well, to find out, let's start by looking to Combs et al. 2009, who questioned participants before the 2004 presidential election between then-incumbent George W. Bush and John Kerry. 2 months before the election, participants were asked about their political affiliations as either Democrat or Republican. Sadly, libertarians and other third-party supporters were not included, but then again, perhaps that's for the best.
You only have to listen. It's happening. It's over.
Then, 2 months later, right before the election, subjects read an article about both politicians being in an embarrassing situation, either the W falling off of his bicycle, or Kerry in an awkward-looking plastic suit while at a visit to NASA. Respondents in the supposedly neutral condition read a negative article about economic problems under Bush. The researchers stated that they could not find a single negative news article about Democrats at the time to further use for their control condition. Well, I guess some things never change, now do they? Participants' degree of amusement at these embarrassing images of Kerry and Bush were assessed, along with news about poor economic performance. Self-described Democrats reported significantly more Schadenfreude than did Republicans when they thought about the economic problems under Bush, yet were also unconcerned with Bush's health, indicating that they gained so much satisfaction from seeing his failure that they did not care about his physical well-being. In regards to the article about Bush falling off his bicycle, Democrats were predictably more amused by the story than were Republicans, and were again unconcerned with Bush's condition, while Republicans were. Expectedly, and in contrast, Republicans were more amused by the photo of John Kerry in his quote bunny suit than were Democrats. But both were equally concerned for John Kerry's well-being, indicating that Republicans, while they may be just as likely to find a politician's gaffe amusing, continue to care about the well-being of a political figure even if they disagree with him, while in contrast, Democrats do not. Compared to the initial identification with a political party assessed 2 months prior to the election, the researchers also looked at political identification after seeing these embarrassing news articles. They found that Democrats' strength of party identification was positively and strongly correlated with Schadenfreude as a result of the economic downturn under Bush, and also among those more strongly identified as Democrats themselves when they felt positive emotions after exposure to the story about Bush falling off of his bicycle. For Republicans, thinking about economic decline was related to negative feelings about Bush's bicycle fall, but simultaneously also related to positive feelings about Kerry in the NASA suit and to feelings of Schadenfreude. In toto, the more Republicans were preoccupied with the decline in the economy, the more they also tended to feel bad over Bush's tumble, and tended to feel more amused by Kerry's mishap. In contrast, Democrats who felt pleasure over the economic downturn also tended to feel pleasure over Bush's minor accident. Thus, both Democrats and Republicans find joy in the misfortunes of a political figure to which they oppose. Neither Democrats nor Republicans felt unconcerned for the health of John Kerry, while Democrats were unconcerned with the well-being of George Bush, which may be in large part due to the manipulation because, no matter how embarrassing this photo is, Kerry was in no physical danger from his fashion faux pas. To account for some potential issues in the first study, the researchers conducted a second experiment before the 2006 midterm elections. As before, participants' political orientation and degree of identification with the two parties was assessed. This time, participants read several recent news articles about various misfortunes, including 2 articles of interest to the general American public, one about the death of soldiers, and one about poor economic news. The researchers found a significant interaction between feelings of Schadenfreude and the article about troop deaths, in that specifically, Democrats felt considerably more Schadenfreude when reading about the deaths of American troops compared to Republicans when they strongly identified as Democrats, while both political orientations expressed similar levels of Schadenfreude when they loosely identified with their respective political parties. In other words, this means yes, Democrats took joy in the death and suffering of American citizens, while Republicans generally did not.
You're a bad person. Like, all the way through to your core.
But hang on, because Republicans can, of course, be a bit shit too. A third study further expanded this line of research to then-presidential candidate Barack Obama. Once again, self-described Republicans and Democrats read an article about Mr. Obama's time as an Illinois senator. The article read that tens of thousands of Illinois residents had lost their jobs as a result of a bill that Obama wrote and sponsored because businesses could no longer afford the wage increase that he had supported, and consequently ended up firing or laying off many employees. As a result, many of those who had lost their jobs had to foreclose on their mortgages. This article was fictitious, but at the time, in 2008, many participants were unfamiliar with Obama's background as a politician, but as a member of the Chicago justice system, likely wouldn't have surprised anyone. Further, the prompt was likely to evoke conflicting emotions in Democrats, who would arguably be more prone to agree with wage increases and therefore be particularly negatively influenced by news of such legislation's failure, and would similarly evoke Schadenfreude in Republicans in reading about said failure. As expected, Republicans who highly identified with the party were very amused by Obama's failure, and thereby the hardships faced by Illinois citizens in turn, while high-identifying Democrats really did not find this news entertaining whatsoever. Low-identifier Republicans and low-identifier Democrats equally found the news to be distasteful. This is just some further evidence of the circumstantial nature of Schadenfreude, which oftentimes makes it come off as hypocritical, likely precisely because, as of the time of these data collection, following the 2006 midterms, Republicans lost their majority control of both houses of Congress. Specifically, 2006 was the first year since the formation of the Republican Party that not a single Republican captured any House, Senate, or gubernatorial seat previously held by a Democrat. Thus, it is likely that this amusement at the failure of Obama was in part due to feelings of political envy. In a final study in this set, after again measuring political affiliation, the researchers created 2 news articles which detailed an economic crisis which was ostensibly caused either by Obama or by John McCain, and was conducted during the end of the 2008 primaries when both were the frontrunners for their respective parties' nominations. The article described a bill that was purportedly opposed either by McCain or by Obama. The story further suggested that had the bill passed, the economic and housing crisis of the time may have been avoided entirely, citing a prominent economist who had urged the candidate to support the measure, but to no avail. The economist elaborated that the candidate in question had, quote, really blown it on this thing, and that many people, quote, are hurting economically because of the housing crisis. So, making it very clear that either Obama or McCain had majorly negatively influenced the lives of millions of Americans by refusing to sign this bill. Both Schadenfreude and distress about this article were measured. They found that Republicans felt low degrees of Schadenfreude regarding McCain's refusal to sign the bill, but high degrees when Obama had refused to sign it. The opposite was the case for Democrats, who felt high levels of Schadenfreude when McCain refused to sign the bill, but low levels when Obama did. I should note that Republicans felt significantly more Schadenfreude than did Democrats when Obama had not signed the bill, but that's likely because Democrats are expected to be the party that engages in a bit more direct economic influence, while Republicans tend to, in theory at least if not in practice, be the more laissez-faire of the two groups economically. Both Democrats and Republicans felt more negative emotions when their particular guy didn't sign the bill, but Democrats experienced slightly more than did Republicans. In aggregate, people from both parties perceived more harm as having been done when McCain had not signed the bill than Obama. Further, Democrats and Republicans perceived themselves as having been more personally harmed by the failure of their respective presidential frontrunner than the oppositional frontrunner. Once again, the strength of political identification played a role here and really illustrated the differences between Schadenfreude across the political parties. Republicans who strongly identified with their party felt a lot of Schadenfreude when Obama had not signed the bill, and far less when they loosely identified with their party. In contrast, Democrats felt absolutely no Schadenfreude when they read about Obama failing to sign the bill, regardless of their strength of identification with the Democrats. They really could not take a single joke about Obama.
What's happening is you made Barack Obama very angry, and when you make him angry, he turns into the Rock Obama.
Please clap.
Results towards McCain were far more typical to what we've seen in other research, in that strong identifier Republicans were unamused by McCain's mishandling of the bill, while high identifier Democrats were greatly amused, even more so than were low identifier Democrats and Republicans in their responses to McCain's misstep. But Democrats in general really did not enjoy reading about Obama's failure whatsoever, while Republicans, it seems, could at least take a joke at their own expense. Similar results were found in a slightly more recent study from Kreisel and Webster 2018. Participants were asked to select the U.S. political party that they identified with, be it Republican, Democrat, Independent, or of course, the most relevant political party, Jeb.
Please clap.
And whether or not they were a US citizen. Respondents' collective levels of self-esteem were measured via a triad of social aspects: membership, that is feeling like a valued member of a social group; pride, that is feeling good about one's social group membership; and identity, that is feeling as if one's social group memberships are a positive reflection upon the self. Benign and malicious Schadenfreude and general self-esteem were measured as well. Participants then read a fabricated news article about Robert Hunter, the researchers' choice of names, not mine. Although, what did they mean by this? Who was described either as a Republican member of the House Ethics Committee, as a Democrat member of the committee, or as a CEO who had been implicated in a number of scandals, including losing his fortune in a Ponzi scheme, trying to bribe another member of Congress, defrauding the American people, or having been involved in a sex scandal, of which there were 3 specific variations. One with at least 3 mistresses, one with an unknown paramour, and one with a child.
There is only one thing worse than a rapist. Boom. A child. No.
This was a fictional politician or CEO, but I should note that Robert is Hunter Biden's first name. Again, this was published in 2018, so this is all just serendipity, I guess. But serendipity I am enjoying. Anyway, these stories were framed as particularly hypocritical, given that Robert Hunter had previously described his opponents as, quote, sexually retarded.
You use the hour.
That is not a quote from me, YouTube. That is a quote from a stimuli in a published scientific study. Anyway, participants' levels of Schadenfreude and their likelihood to share the story either with friends or with others on social media were also measured. Democrats felt about equal levels of Schadenfreude when reading about the downfall either of a CEO or a Republican, while the opposite was the case for Republicans. Republicans were as likely to share a story about a Democrat or the CEO, and were unlikely to share a story about a Republican. In contrast, Democrats were actually more prone to share a story about a Democrat than they were about a CEO, but were still the most likely to share one of these negative stories about a Republican, more so than any group was to share any story. The collective self-esteem measures of membership and identity reported higher intentions of sharing the story with others, but did not actually predict social media sharing. However, that may be because only 11% of the total sample showed any desire to share the story about these unknown politicians on their social media feeds. This runs a bit counter to findings related to individual self-esteem, which typically predicts that self-esteem is negatively related to Schadenfreude, but in this case, collective self-esteem was related to a desire to share information about someone else's misfortune when they were not a member of one's political in-group. So far, I've talked exclusively about American politics, but don't get it twisted. This doesn't just influence American political divides, but international politics as well, as seen in Auerkirk et al. 2016. The first study in this set looked at Dutch politics in particular, envy, and Schadenfreude directly after the fall of the Dutch coalition government, or the Second Purple Cabinet. And I get that this is going to be a bit foreign to many of you, except for my friends in the Netherlands, but stay with me here so we can all learn a little bit of a short history about Dutch politics. So, take it away.
The Netherlands has a multi-party system comprised by a coalition of multiple parties. This study was conducted on the day following the fall of the Dutch coalition government led by PM Jan-Peter Balkenende in October of 2002. After this fall, Balkenende formed a new government during the socio-political upheaval that followed the death of politician Pim Fortuyn. Fortuyn headed his own novel right-wing conservative party, the List Pim Fortuyn, LPF, which emphasized a stricter immigration policy as its core message. On May 6, 2002, 9 days before the election, a leading national newspaper published poll results in which the LPF took the lead. On the same day, Fortuyn was shot and killed by an environmental activist, causing unprecedented political unrest. In the election, 9 days later, the LPF came in second, losing to the centre-right Christian Democrat Party, CDA, headed by Balkenende. The other parties that had been in power for 8 years lost 39 of their 83 seats in parliament, indicating a shift towards the right in Dutch politics, and mirroring the right-wing shift in the United States following 9/11.
With all of that context in mind, Dutch participants who were politically activated felt less Schadenfreude when they did not strongly identify with other Dutch political parties and learned of Fortune's death, but felt more Schadenfreude when they strongly identified with an oppositional Dutch party. Less politically involved participants felt more Schadenfreude when learning about Fortune's death, when they less strongly identified with an oppositional political group, and less Schadenfreude when they strongly identified with a non-LPF group as well. This means that people who are low-information voters and also don't tend to have strong political affiliations also tend to take the most pleasure in the suffering of all political figures regardless of their orientations, while people more involved in politics and strongly identify with a political party only find more enjoyment in the suffering of an oppositional out-group politician compared to highly involved people without a strong identification towards a political party. For supporters of the LPF, low party identification was nearly identical regardless of involvement. In contrast, high-involvement LPF voters felt less Schadenfreude upon hearing the news of Fortune's death than did low-involvement voters. When participants read Fortune's obituary, rather than a news article about the shooting, the results were even more pronounced here. Low identifiers with a non-LPF political party, when they were also low in involvement, felt very little Schadenfreude upon reading the obituary, and low-information, high identifiers with an oppositional party experienced even less Schadenfreude. In contrast, high-information, high-oppositional party identifiers found the obituary absolutely hilarious. There were almost no changes in those who identified with the LPF, regardless of their levels of personal involvement when they read the obituary, all finding the article highly unamusing. So yes, the takeaway here is that people who oppose a political party and are highly involved in politics are likely to find a great deal of joy in the death or suffering of a political opponent. And we're certainly seeing that now, aren't we? To extend this back to US politics, this might mean low-involvement Democrats who don't strongly identify with their party might find Trump getting COVID less amusing than low-involvement Democrats who more strongly identify with their party. In contrast, high-involvement Democrats who strongly identify with the party would find Trump getting COVID to be very amusing. We could surmise that the opposite would likely be the case for high and low involvement as well as high and low identification Republicans as well, upon hearing about Biden breaking his foot while chasing his dog out of the shower. That all being said, let's temporarily get away from politics for a moment to keep in mind what all of this means for human communication in general, and that seemingly all political groups are prone to revel in the suffering of their opponents.
You sold a gun to a murderer so you could play video games?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you spend all day shuffling words around, you can make anything sound bad, Morty.
While we all have an individual identity, the things that make us different from others, we all also have social identities. And while this contains important beliefs like political orientation, it also contains affiliation with far less meaningful groups. Well, maybe I guess it depends on how deep your fandom dedication goes, but that means things like our favorite music genres, our fashion choices, our hobbies, and even the products that we support. All of these things make up our social identities, and there is perhaps no social identity more insufferable through the aughts and the 2010s. No, not politics, but technology-based social identities. By that I mean the Mac versus PC, iPhone versus Android debates.
I was writing paper on the PC, and it was like bleep, 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 bleep.
In the context of the fruit wars between Apple or BlackBerry. Random passers-by using a BlackBerry were polled on the streets in Amsterdam and provided with negative consumer reports about the iPhone. Solidarity with BlackBerry users as well as iPhone users, the importance of having a smartphone, hostile feelings towards iPhone users, and opinions towards the iPhone were all included in the product's trustworthiness, beauty, user-friendliness, and feelings of satisfaction, pride, enthusiasm, frustration, disappointment, and irritation elicited by the iPhone in contrast, all being measured. After reading the negative news article about the iPhone, both Schadenfreude and sympathy towards iPhone users was also polled, and participants were asked how likely they might be to share news of the negative article about the iPhone with others. Identification with BlackBerry as a brand was more robustly related to Schadenfreude than was a general interest in smartphones. Further, hostility towards iPhone users and negative feelings associated with Apple were both positively related to Schadenfreude upon reading the negative article, while in contrast, positive thoughts about the Apple brand were negatively related to Schadenfreude. Generally, BlackBerry users felt very little sympathy towards Apple or its users, but felt the most when they had a positive opinion towards the brand in general, and felt the least sympathetic when they had a negative opinion towards Apple. BlackBerry users indicated that they would be the most likely to share information about this scathing news article when they strongly identified with the BlackBerry brand, and when they had a hostile relationship towards the iPhone, and were slightly less likely to share it when they were generally interested in smartphones as a whole, and, somewhat surprisingly, when they felt positive about Apple, perhaps wanting to warn others of the failure of a product that they previously had not been openly negative towards. They were the least likely to share the story when they had positive cognitions, thoughts about the Apple product, potentially seeking to avoid cognitive dissonance. Overall, people who did not identify strongly with BlackBerry as a brand were equally likely to experience Schadenfreude in this scenario, regardless of how generally invested in smartphones he or she was. While high BlackBerry identifiers, who were also generally interested in smartphones, experienced the most Schadenfreude. If people got that riled up about protecting the image of a brand they use in terms of their cell phone to the detriment of another brand, of course that applies to the various brands of politics and people's willingness to destroy their political opponents for their own sense of joy. Nye and Otto, 2020, further examined the relationship between Schadenfreude and political messages. In their first experiment, participants read about gun violence in the United States and a new proposal from Congress to expand gun control legislation by requiring licenses and background checks for all gun distributors, prohibiting the sale of guns or ammunition to unstable people, supported by former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan. They then read one of 3 fabricated tweets supposedly from Bernie Sanders, one of which praised the new legislation and called for bipartisan agreement on passing the bill. In a second tweet, Bernie criticized Ryan sternly, saying that he cares more about money from lobbies than about American lives, and finally, in a third tweet, Bernie openly verbally attacked Ryan while using expletives in a very emotional tone. Participants' positive and negative opinions towards a number of politicians, including Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel, as well as Ryan and Sanders, were assessed. After reading Bernie's tweets, participants' levels of general Schadenfreude were measured using a series of vignettes wherein something bad happened to a businessman, a classmate, or a member of a rival sports team, and then rated the degree to which he or she felt amused, satisfied, pleased, relieved, and sad upon reading that vignette. They then found that perceptions of amusement related to Bernie's scathing tweet was related positively to levels of general Schadenfreude, finding the aggressive tweet far funnier than those with low or moderate degrees of general Schadenfreude. There was a non-significant effect in participants' low intrate Schadenfreude who found the tweets less amusing, while for participants with high levels of Schadenfreude, they enjoyed the tweets far more. From these data, we could argue that Schadenfreude is also much of what fueled Trump's 2016 campaign, by many people who are generally high in Schadenfreude likely finding enjoyment in messages about draining the swamp or locking her up, or now from many people finding enjoyment in the banning of Trump and Trump supporters from social media, arresting protesters or worse, and cheering for police brutality, despite months of protesting it. In a second experiment, participants read a statement purportedly made either by a Republican or a Democrat politician, which focused either on healthcare or on immigration. This message was ambiguous in its emotional framing so that it could be seen as the politician either defending the stances of their own party or attacking the oppositional party. Subjects then read a story about a former classmate and know-it-all who was always gloating about his or her grades, skills, wealth, and success, and was recently fired from his or her job to measure their basal levels of Schadenfreude. Subjects generally found the politician's negative message towards another party as more amusing, but the results were not uniform. Respondents found it funnier when the Democrat attacked the Republican, but not vice versa on the topic of healthcare. Schadenfreude was negatively related to the Democrat target, but positively related to the Republican target, indicating that a general sample of people enjoy seeing Republicans being embarrassed, but do not find the same embarrassment to be funny regarding Democrats. You might think, well, Aiden, that's because the sample must have been overwhelmingly Democrat, right? But no, it was a fairly even split, with 55% of respondents describing themselves as Democrats. This is instead, again, evidence that Republicans can laugh at themselves and Democrats just cannot. Nye and Otto's third experiment was comprised of several conditions based on comments purportedly sponsored by Democrat Pete Buttigieg, targeting Republican Mitch McConnell. In Condition 1, participants saw a general message from Buttigieg in support of universal health care. A second condition message attacked either McConnell's position on healthcare or his personal character. Finally, the last series of messages were satirical jokes regarding McConnell in general. Because the researchers did not specify, I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of comparisons to a certain herpetofauna species as one of the jokes in this stimuli.
I am Mitch McConnell. Feed me poor people.
This time, the dark personality traits of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism were assessed. Machiavellianism is typified by a tendency to manipulate and exploit others, while psychopathy is typified by antisocial behavior, impulsivity, selfishness, callousness, and remorselessness. And I think we all know what narcissism is. Deservedness, which is a perception that bad things happen to bad people, and self-esteem were also measured. To measure Schadenfreude, some respondents watched a video of a man bragging about his superior Chad physicality and then doing a cannonball into a frozen pool and painfully landing on solid ice. You have no idea the restraint it took me to show you the actual stimuli that they used, and not the far more recent video of Tom Segura, a man who loves to watch people getting crushed by cars, similarly experiencing the business end of his own Schadenfreude. More restraint than I possess.
Oh. Somebody just came. Oh, she just kicked him again.
Yeah, I don't know how funny this is, Tom. What part's funniest to you? He's getting tased or kicked?
Just that he's getting it because he deserves it.
Anyway, participants who saw attacks lobbed at McConnell had a far more negative opinion towards him. In a twist of expectations, people who were low in Schadenfreude were actually the least favorable towards McConnell, while also perceiving the messages towards him as the most negative. In contrast, people high in Schadenfreude liked the negative messages more, but were also more favorable towards Mitch. These findings are indicative that just because someone is laughing at the misfortunes of another does not necessarily mean that they dislike or like that person. Instead, being able to laugh at someone may increase positive perceptions of that person. So with all of that in mind, let's look further into the connections between Schadenfreude, politics, and perceptions of justice. When it comes to politics and Schadenfreude, it may not always be the case that we are just laughing at the misfortunes of a political opponent, but also that we may believe the negative things that befall said opponent are a form of justice. Belief in a just world is a trait that some people possess that leads them to generally believe that good or bad things happen for a reason. Or perhaps more succinctly, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Classic research from Rubin and Peplau in 1975 found that students who believe in a just world were more likely to consider themselves to be conservative, and in the relevant election of the age, said they intended to vote for Republican Richard Nixon rather than Democrat George McGovern. I'm sorry I don't have much more recent research on that particular relationship directly, because for some reason no one's replicating it. Why is anyone's guess? However, a very slightly more recent study from Dittmar and Dickinson 1993 found that even liberals think that conservatives see the world as a more fair place than they themselves do. In this study, participants rated to what degree they felt that both themselves and people of different political orientations believe that the world is fair, and the results are fairly telling. Left-wing people tended to believe that conservatives think the world is just even more than they actually do, and similarly, while conservatives think that left-wingers believe the world is less just than they actually do, left-leaning people were far more likely to believe that the world is an unfair place then were conservatives or were moderates. In short, and in relationship to Schadenfreude, conservatives are more prone to believe that bad things happen to others for a just reason, while left-wing people are more likely to believe that bad things happen to others for no reason in particular. Petrashkevich assessed the relationship between belief in a just world and Schadenfreude. Participants in this study read a story about a blind Colombian student, Adriana, who was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to attend college in the United States, while others read the same story but had their belief in a just world challenged by subsequently reading that her visa to the US was denied and was unable to travel abroad for school. Another story described a local organization called the Love Kitchen, which provided free meals to the homeless and was funded by philanthropists.
I'm a full-on rapist, you know? Africans, dyslexics, children, that sort of thing.
A just world challenging version of the story included an addendum that, due to a decline in the economy, the kitchen would soon be forced to close its doors. After reading one of these stories, participants were then told they could spend as much time as they wished reading an article containing stories related to 10 Darwin Awards, designed to elicit feelings of Schadenfreude at the disastrous failings of others. Participants were then asked how likely he or she might be to share the Darwin Award stories with their friends. People whose belief in a just world had just been challenged spent more time reading about the Darwin Awards, indicating that they likely sought to expose themselves to more stories of just desserts when their faith in the goodness of the universe had been threatened. After the experiment, participants who had strong beliefs in a just world were more likely to say that they would share the Darwin Award articles that they read with others, but also reported that after reading the stories about Adriana and the Love Kitchen, their belief in a just world was subsequently decreased. Again, sharing these stories and convincing others that the world is a fair place may serve as a coping mechanism through which one can reassert his or her beliefs in karma, such as believing that the best candidate will win a political race. The aforementioned findings might lead one to believe in the invisible hand of justice, and thereby perhaps in belief in God or religiosity. A significant body of research has related fear of the big sleep, also called mortality salience, to belief in a just world, in that people who believe the universe is fair are less afraid of their inevitable demise. A study from Bassett and Kate, 2014, sought to further understand the relationships between mortality salience, belief in a just world, and Schadenfreude by studying the reactions of Christians towards a disaster. Christian participants were either asked to think about death or about dental pain, and then read one of two stories, one about an earthquake destroying a mosque, and the other about a tornado destroying a Christian church, and were asked how happy these stories made them feel, as well as their beliefs in a just world in response. The obliteration of the church had no effect on the perceptions of the justness of the universe, regardless of whether or not participants had thought about death or about pain beforehand. In contrast, when the Christian participants thought about pain and read that a mosque had been leveled, their belief in a just world was higher. In toto, Christians found the destruction of the church far less funny than the destruction of the mosque, but found both incidences slightly more amusing when not thinking about death. Thus, we tend to be less likely to experience Schadenfreude when thinking about something bad happening to us, but generally are more than happy to laugh at the misfortune of a religious outgroup. And again, given that conservatism is related to religiosity and belief in a just world, this may mean that conservatives are more likely to find the suffering of others amusing. Increasingly over time, politicians have shifted from being just public figures into being all-out celebrities, and cases of celebrities becoming politicians, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger or Donald Trump, are certainly prime examples of the antithesis of that trend. Just as belief in a just world is related to conservatism, McClutchan 2003 similarly found a relationship between Machiavellianism, which is itself related to increased Schadenfreude, belief in a just world, and celebrity worship. Participants were asked to identify their favorite celebrities, and although, at the time, none selected politicians, as previously mentioned, the lines between the two categories have become increasingly blurred in subsequent years. Those who believed that the world is a fair place held more positive opinions towards their favorite celebrities. In contrast, Machiavellianism was related negatively to liking a celebrity and also negatively related to belief in a just world. the Alsop Machiavellianism instrument, which specifically focused on the ruthless aspect of Machiavellianism, was negatively but negligibly related to belief in a just world, but positively related to celebrity worship. These data indicate that people who tend to have generally positive opinions towards celebrities and politicians, by extension, are more likely to believe that their status is the product of a fair society, while those who dislike celebrities or politicians tend to be more prone towards Machiavellianism. Relating this further to celebrities, of which, again, I think we can agree are often politicians and vice versa at this point, Shabahang et al. 2020 examined the relationship between belief in a just world and celebrity hate. Persian participants were asked to think about their most hated celebrity and answered questions regarding how much they hated that person, as well as their perceptions of that person's credibility and their belief in a just world. Physical attractiveness of a celebrity was related to higher perceptions of that celebrity's trustworthiness, expertise, and credibility. When a celebrity was seen as trustworthy, participants were more likely to feel intimacy towards them, but also be less passionate towards them and less likely to hate them. Interestingly, belief in a source's credibility was negatively related to belief in a just world and celebrity hate. That is, perhaps people who are seen as non-credible are unlikely to also be hated, and rather, they are pitied. I would say this might apply to someone like Alex Jones, who is seen by many as a lovable, harmless conspiracy theorist, but not someone they necessarily hate.
I'm kind of retarded.
Instead, low intimacy, passion, and commitment were all related to celebrity hate, while belief in a just world was not. People who believe the world is unjust, which we know are less likely to be conservative people, are more prone to hate celebrities, and that does include people like Trump. And all of that hate is bolstered by a degree of intimacy, passion, and commitment. Well, I don't know what else you would call the modern left recently besides passionate and committed. Clearly, the months of BLM activism have demonstrated that. It also means people who believe the world is just are less likely to hate celebrities, just in general, be they politicians or otherwise. And because conservatives are more likely to believe in a just world, this means that conservatives are less likely to truly hate politicians than are left-leaning people, at least predictably. Given that 2020 was a year majorly affected by mortality salience, be it via the coup or the ongoing political unrest, and that mortality salience is unlikely to decrease anytime soon, what are the relationships between belief in a just world and mortality salience? Bullet 2020 examined these interactions in employees of high mortality salient organizations, such as hospitals, morgues, and, I guess, Pakistani gender programs, and low mortality salient organizations such as offices. Participants were asked to either think about death or about dental pain, and then asked a number of questions about self-esteem and religious beliefs. She found that people who work in jobs wherein their mortality was often salient, such as nurses, were less likely to believe in a just world, and were minimally less likely to be religious than those in the same jobs who had not been tasked to think about death. Relatedly, when asked to think about death, those who worked in mortality salient organizations reported slightly decreased self-esteem. In contrast, people who work in low mortality salient jobs, such as in an office, tended to be more religious, while they were similarly likely to believe that the world was unfair and be low in self-esteem when specifically they were thinking about death. What these data indicate then is that people may be less likely to believe that the world is just during periods of health crises, and this in turn may influence conservatism negatively. That is, when people are afraid of their own death, they may be more likely to believe that the world is a bad place and thereby be less conservative. Similarly, data from Su and Shen 2020 found that conservatives are generally unafraid of COVID, and that fear of COVID tended to move more left-leaning people further left in their own political beliefs. Given that belief in a just world is related to conservative political orientation, and is negatively related to both celebrity hate and Machiavellianism, which we saw was itself related to Schadenfreude, is Machiavellianism still related to conservatism? Well, research from Arvin 2013 certainly illustrates as such. But hang on, because it's a little bit complicated. Participants in this study were first asked to self-identify either as conservative or liberal, and then their levels of dark triad traits, that is, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism, were measured. They were then asked to what degree he or she agreed with a series of political policies, and this agreement was again correlated to their political identification and dark triad personality items. Now, Arvan did something a little bit unusual here, which is fairly interesting, in that he found conservative data significant at a level below 0.0001. What that means is, were he to reconduct this experiment, he would expect to see different results only once out of 99,999 different retests of conservatives. But the levels for liberal relationships were limited to lower levels of significance, meaning greater potential for error in the relationship between political beliefs and dark triad traits in liberals, but not so much in conservatives. Regardless, he found that 7 of the 15 political questions that were related to conservatism were also related to Machiavellianism, compared to only 4 items related to liberalism and in turn to Machiavellianism. Specifically, for conservatives, questions about immigration, anti-terrorism, religious education, and gay rights were all related to Machiavellianism, while for liberals, questions about foreign intervention, international politics, and environmentalism were related to Machiavellianism. These same items were also generally related to narcissism in both liberals and conservatives. In contrast, only 1 item was related to psychopathy in liberals rather than in conservatives, that being favorability towards abortion. Thus, specifically looking back to Machiavellianism and its relationship to Schadenfreude, conservative beliefs may be slightly more related to Machiavellianism than our liberal beliefs. And Machiavellianism is itself positively related to Schadenfreude, but not belief in a just world, which is also more common in conservatives, and negatively related to Schadenfreude. My point in bringing all of this complicated stuff up is that the evidence seemed to indicate that conservatives are just as likely as liberals to experience political Schadenfreude, and the current state of things in the United States and throughout the world is certainly evidence of that. People who during the summer of 2020 wanted to defund the police now suddenly think it's hilarious to watch a woman die at the hands of a cop. In contrast, people who thought it was hilarious all summer to watch protesters get BTFO'd aren't laughing anymore. If all of this seems hypocritical, it's because it is. But it's hypocritical based on our own individual political identifications and how those identifications influence whether or not we experience Schadenfreude at any given turn. Arvan's data are a bit outdated for the current political climate, but the fact that left-leaning people are currently cheering for authoritarianism, thinking it will only affect the people that they don't like, would likely produce the same results that he saw today. That is, it's hysterical when it happens to my enemy, but it's an insurrection when it happens to me. We're all maybe just a little bit psychologically designed to be hypocritical then.
It's time for guillotine. It's time to raise the boards. It's time to sharpen blades. We just can't take this anymore.
Relatedly, but outside of politics specifically, it seems that we just like to see people who are not a part of our same social group fail. And moreover, we are more or less likely to see the wins of outgroups as illegitimate based on our personological variables, as Leach and Spears 2008 indicated. Students at the University of Amsterdam were told their school was involved in an inter-university quiz competition. Some read that University of Amsterdam students came in second to last place against other universities, while others read that students from the University of Amsterdam came in second place overall. This is important because in either case, there were always other groups who lost or won comparatively to the university that the student belonged to. Participants were asked about their perceptions of their in-group's performance and the legitimacy or illegitimacy of their in-group's inferiority compared to other schools, the pain felt in response to feelings of inferiority, how much they were interested in the competition, their dislike of other schools, the illegitimacy of the other school's success, and their general levels of envy. They were also then told that the universities that won against their school eventually lost to the University of Groningen, introducing an element of Schadenfreude, and the degree of enjoyment they received from this loss was measured. When an outgroup success was seen as illegitimate, this sensation was not significantly directly related to pain associated with feelings of inferiority nor to anger. In contrast, feelings of inferiority were related to envy of the outgroup, pain related to the inferiority, and ultimately, Schadenfreude towards the failure of the outgroup. Interestingly, intrinsic dislike of the outgroup was unrelated to any of these variables. This means that just because an outgroup wins does not cause anger, pain, or envy inherent. Instead, it is when a group feels inferior that they are more likely to experience envy, anger, and ultimately Schadenfreude at the loss of their opponent, and also be more prone to believe the success of the outgroup was illegitimate. A second study replicated the first with some additional variables, specifically emotional responses. Once again, inherent dislike of the outgroup was unrelated to anything else, which certainly can't be said of political rivalry, but wasn't found in this context, so keep that in mind, I suppose. Perceived illegitimacy of the outgroup success in the quiz was slightly related to anger towards the outgroup, and in turn, feelings of hostility and frustration. Pain related to feelings of inferiority instead were strongly related to anger, and anger towards the outgroup was related moderately to Schadenfreude in response to the loss of another team. Pain associated with feeling inferior was associated with feelings of threat, frustration, and shame. In contrast, envy was unrelated to Schadenfreude. The relationship to politics here should be fairly obvious, but let's elaborate upon them. Just thinking that your team lost unfairly alone isn't enough to make people angry, even if they've always been your rival team. Instead, people must not only feel cheated, but also feel as though they have been made inferior to the winning team to get them really, really mad, envious, make them feel pain, and subsequently enjoy the suffering of their opposition. I think you could make this argument both for the 2016 United States election and the 2020 US election. In 2016, the left wing was told by every mainstream news source that the Russians hacked the election, and in 2020, well, release the Kraken, I suppose. In 2016, a lot of the rage from the left was from the belief that Trump would hurt the LGBTQ community or put kids in cages. And in 2020, because numerous politicians are now actively calling for re-education camps.
There are millions of Americans, almost all white, almost all Republicans, who somehow need to be deprogrammed. It's as if they are members of a cult.
And the question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people who have signed up for the cult of Trump?
We'll go through all the Republican voters and Homeland Security will take their children away. And we'll put them into re-education camps.
Amen.
Banning every conservative from social media, arresting them and getting them fired from their jobs, and, maybe that's just a little bit different, I would say, since only one is actually happening, but hey, that's politics, I guess. Point is, when an outgroup wins, we feel Schadenfreude upon learning of that group's subsequent failures. That describes Trump's entire career, at least to me. And I'm sure it will describe Biden's as well. It's not a revolutionary idea to propose that one political group gets angry and envious and upset when they feel that they are made inferior to another political group, and subsequently feel gleeful when something bad happens to that political group, even if it all is hypocritical. This is, as the authors describe it, the vengefulness of the impotent. As a fish to the sea, as a bird to the sky, so is contempt to the contemptible. And with that, let's come to a few conclusions. We've all occasionally felt just a little bit of Schadenfreude. It's not an extreme idea to suggest that we all find it a little bit funny to see someone wipe out. However, it seems we are most likely to enjoy seeing the humiliation and embarrassment of people in positions of power. Often this takes the form of celebrity gossip and tabloid news, but seemingly just as commonly in finding enjoyment in the downfalls of politicians and political activists when they fail in some way. It's surely a bit disconcerting that this often takes the form of laughing not just at minor misfortunes of others, but at the very real suffering and even deaths of others. But the tendency seems endemic to human nature nonetheless. People will laugh at tragedies, particularly when they befall their political opponents, and if there's ever an ongoing political travesty that you find particularly hypocritical, well, Schadenfreude is often usually in part to blame. Republicans think it's funny when Joe Biden slips and falls, and Democrats find it funny when a woman with a Gadsden flag is literally tread upon to death. It sounds awful because it is, but it's highly unlikely that aspect of humanity will ever change. Moreover, when we look at the numerous variables associated with political Schadenfreude, there's no indication, at least none that I can find, that one political party or ideology is more prone to this propensity over another. While the likelihood to experience Schadenfreude is in part dependent on things like belief in a just world and mortality salience, overall, we're all just more likely to laugh when those who we oppose lose, more than we are to sympathize. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you feel bad when someone you disagree with politically stubs their toe? Or do you laugh? Is there a degree to which the suffering of those we disagree with is no longer humorous? Do you think some people are more likely to laugh at the suffering of others than are others? And is that tendency related to politics or completely independent? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who has supported the channel, because YouTube is actively and heavily silencing and restricting my videos. I mean, to a factor of seeing 1/10 the viewership within a matter of 3 months. If you like this content, please, please, please share it with others, because YouTube is suppressing it actively. Or by supporting my channel on Patreon or Subscribestar, or by purchasing something from my merch store. Anything helps, guys. In the last video in this series, we'll look more at the relationships between envy and Schadenfreude to more thoroughly understand who tends to enjoy seeing others suffer and why. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Untitled.